All right.
We're ready?
Oh, yeah, we're good.
Okay. All right. So, welcome back. Gavin and I are here to discuss the first few chapters from Wrangham's book, our second book for the class. Uh, Richard Wrangham's book is called The Goodness Paradox. The subtitle is The Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. And just a couple of businessy sorts of things to clear up. This is our second and final book for this class. We'll cover the first 4 chapters today. Then next week, we'll discuss chapters 5 through 8. And the final week, week 7, okay? So we're in week 5, and we have 3 weeks, including this week, remaining in this course. Okay, so it's rapidly coming to a close here. Week 7, our final week, we will discuss the remaining chapters of Wrangham, and that's chapters 9 through 13, and the afterword. We encourage you to read the afterword. It's sort of Wrangham's sort of reflections since the hardback was published. The book we assigned is the paperback because it's cheaper, but I think it's worth reading. Okay, let's see, a couple of things then. Let me point out that we will distribute the take-home exam during the 7th week. In fact, we'll distribute it on August 12th. That's Wednesday, August 12th. Is that correct, Gavin? Is it Wednesday?
I know it is a Wednesday, and then it's a week
Okay,
before
good.
exams are due, so August 12th sounds correct.
Okay. We'll distribute the final exam. It'll be an essay exam. We haven't written it yet, so we don't know, but probably 4 very, very broad essay questions. You will have 1 week to complete the exam. You are more than welcome to send drafts of your exam responses to Gavin or I. We'll tell you more about that, and we'll give you more details as it gets closer. There's a certain point at which we can't accept drafts any longer because we just won't have the time to sort of thoughtfully review it and offer comments, and then you won't have the time to make changes and then submit it. Bottom line is it's a take-home exam. You'll have your books. You'll have access to you'll have it all. You'll have access to all the videos we've seen, all the the lectures, the interviews, the podcasts. We certainly encourage you to ask questions or of your fellow students and share your responses. Absolutely, of course, you will be responsible for your own independently written exam, but we absolutely encourage you to discuss these questions with other students. That's how a lot of stuff gets figured out, is by sort of talking about it with people who are more familiar with the material. Okay, so let's see here. For this week, we're asking you to watch 2 things online or listen. Watch and or listen. One is Richard Wrangham's recent lecture at Harvard. It was probably about a year ago now, specifically on this book. And so in many ways, it gives a really wonderful summary of the main points that he's raising throughout this book. But this is in, I think it's about 50 minutes, and I think he fields questions for a few minutes after the talk. So that's one, and Gavin will be sending out the link if you haven't already. Have you already sent that out, Gavin?
Yep. Yeah, oh yeah, it's available.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so you've already put them out, so they simply go to them.
The links to YouTube are up on Moodle, so.
Great. So there are 2 things we're asking you to watch this week. One is is Wrangham's lecture on the book. It's about an hour long. We also like you to watch and listen to a podcast interview that Wrangham did with a fairly well-known science podcaster called Ricardo Lopez, and his podcast is called The Dissenter. But it's a really, really interesting discussion, very sort of loose discussion with Richard Wrangham about his new book and about some of his research and sort of how he came to write this book. And so that's, again, an hour well spent of your time. So all we can do is simply encourage you. You will get more out of the book if you view and listen to this lecture and to this podcast. Okay, I understand from Gavin and I were just talking just before we came online here, and Gavin indicated that you guys are doing a great job keeping up with the discussion questions and responses to other students' discussion questions. Maybe you want to comment on that, Gavin?
Yeah, so like Dr. Shackelford said, you guys are doing a great job. I do want to encourage you guys to maybe dig a little bit deeper in some of your discussion questions. There are some people, some of you indicating that you are really enjoying the material, which is awesome, and we're very glad to hear that. But we'd also like to hear what specifically about the material you're enjoying, or even if you don't like it, what do you take issue with, what are you struggling with, and those sorts of things. So if you have not already, I would just like to take this opportunity to please encourage you guys to maybe be a bit more specific in your discussion questions for the weekly material.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. And the further benefit to that is it gives a clearer target for people to respond to. So to the extent that you guys are, identifying reasonably specific points or issues or concerns or points of interest, for example, then that gives a clear, a clear target for your fellow students to respond to. I agree. I liked the way he described blah, 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 blah. Or really, because I didn't understand that part. I wasn't sure what he meant by blah, blah, blah. So it gives a little more to grab a hold of. So do, as Gavin said, please do, take the time to say something that provides a clear target for other people to respond to. And all of this is in service of getting something more out of the material. And you're likely to get more out of the material to the extent that you can engage with your fellow students in the discussion forums, both in terms of laying out your questions and in terms of responding. So again, so far so good, but just, these are words of encouragement and suggestion from Gavin and I. Okay, shall we move ahead?
Yeah, yep.
All right. So we're reading the first few chapters. So it's the introduction, and then I think, so he doesn't call it chapter 1. That's always a little unsettling. It's just called introduction, right? And then there's chapter 2.
Chapter 1 is the paradox. So
I'm sorry.
Introduction 1.
Yes, perfect. Okay, so the introduction is really just setting things up and giving the reader a broad sense of where he's going in this book. Actually, before we proceed, let me just summarize just a tiny bit of what Gavin and I were talking about before we came online, and that is that I suspect many of you will find Wrangham's book easier to read and digest than was Dawkins's book. And that may be in part because the material is less abstract in many ways and sort of less focused on broad conceptual sorts of issues and more specific behaviors and psychological attributes and, with particular species. And so it may be that it's both the, I think primarily this book may well be easier to read and digest because it's a little more focused on, a particular set of issues, virtue and violence in human evolution. And you'll see that Wrangham makes frequent comparisons between humans and several non-human species, in particular bonobos and chimpanzees. Having said all that, I'm rereading this and Gavin's reading along. We're all reading it together. I was struck by just how readable Wrangham is. I found it, just super easy to follow. which isn't to say I don't have questions, but the reading was very smooth. You guys can let us know if you agree. Um, you know, the first chapter here, the introduction, is to basically set things up. And what he wants to set up is sort of, well, it's an overview of the book, but it's also attempting to kind of set up the main issues. And this is true, it's kind of bleeding into chapter 1 as well. But there's very good evidence that humans, relative to other primates, and frankly, relative to other mammals, are both remarkably violent, or can be remarkably violent, and they can be remarkably altruistic, or what you might call virtuous. So we have this dual sort of nature that is less apparent in any other species, where we have the capacity to behave with unbelievable kindness and care, while also being quite capable of inflicting, remarkable cruelty on others, including violence and death. And it's an interesting puzzle that has, my God, it's filled up, hundreds of thousands of pages in philosophy and biology and psychology over the last, 2,000 years, where people feel compelled to make an argument in favor of one side or the other. Are we at base violent but learn how to be virtuous, or are we at base virtuous but learn how to be violent? And certainly many scholars, many very intelligent people, over the last 2,000 years have had something interesting to say. What Wrangham wants to suggest is that both sides are right and both sides are wrong. We are both virtuous and violent. But why that should be true of us, I think, is a puzzle in and of itself. And that's the puzzle, or the paradox, the goodness paradox, that Wrangham is tackling. I mean, once you put it in words, and once you read, sort of the puzzle or the paradox in so many words, it seems shocking that people haven't written more specifically on this paradox. But they haven't, and I think part of it is that Wrangham comes from, a sort of very interdisciplinary background. His early training was with Jane Goodall, working with chimpanzees, and only later in his career did he sort of begin to think about applying evolutionary principles to humans, to human psychology and behavior. So how about, what are some of your thoughts on this first chapter, Gavin?
So past the introduction, you mean?
Or is there anything further we want to add about the introduction?
Well, I think the introduction in chapter 1 sort of go together in that they're setting up. I mean, chapter 1 is sort of aptly named because it's doing the job of setting up the paradox, or this question around which the entire book is sort of centered. And I think that gets the focus of the book you were talking about a second ago, is that, it's all in service of this one sort of fundamental question that, like you said, has been sort of like pondered over extensively for many years. And yeah, I just think it's good to know about his history with primates and chimpanzees. I think that's interesting, and I'm not sure if he gets into it later in the book, but I almost wonder if that's sort of what helped him, develop this perspective of, humans are really neither inherently good or inherently evil, because he sort of saw a similar sort of duality in chimpanzees. And, as to where people in the past have argued, humans are inherently good and corrupted by society, or vice versa, seeing that chimpanzees have the same duality and clearly aren't influenced by their culture or their society, that, both aspects of their nature, the good and the evil, must be inherent. sort of I wonder if that helped him develop the same sort of perspective for humans that he presents in this book.
Yeah, I think certainly that's an important part of it, is seeing, sort of elements of this virtue and violence in chimpanzees. But I think what also did it for Wrangham, and this is part of, his unique background, is he studied common chimpanzees, but he also studied and was aware of work on bonobos. Now, bonobos are very closely related to common chimpanzees, but they, as we'll discuss, in many ways, they behave very differently. Bonobos rarely go to war with, sort of next door neighbors. There's much, much less violence in bonobo society than there is in chimpanzee society. And bonobos, in some way, when you compare bonobos and chimpanzees, people have suggested, glimmers of, sort of the dual nature of humans. So many people have spent time asking, are we closer to bonobos in the way we think, feel, and behave, or are we closer to chimpanzees? Are we more or less virtuous or more or less violent? So you have that thread running through the book as well, and which also is part of Wrangham's sort of primatological background. Is he's very familiar with, the very different natures of bonobos, and they used to be called pygmy chimpanzees, I believe, pygmy and common chimpanzees. I mean, they're extraordinarily closely related. I think they separated. I mean, I'm going to get this wrong, but I want to say, a million or 2 years ago. We share a common ancestor with both bonobos and chimpanzees about 5 to 7 million years ago.
Right.
Chimpanzees and bonobos share a common ancestor more recently. Anyways, there is this strand as well, and he'll talk about bonobos as probably a better model for humans in terms of our evolutionary history. As we'll discover, Wrangham's going to make the argument that humans are sort of quintessentially domesticated. We're a domesticated species. We're self-domesticated. There's been selection against reactive aggression and selection in favor of proactive aggression. Similarly, in bonobos, there's a strong case to be made that they too are self-domesticated, with strong selection against reactive aggression and not selection for proactive aggression, but certainly selection against reactive aggression. They're capable of being proactively aggressive as well, not to the extent. They don't seem to delight in it as much as do chimpanzees or humans, for that matter.
Okay.
We're accidentally covering a lot of ground, but that's okay. I mean, again, this is part of the introduction, sort of setting things up, and so sort of get a glimpse of where he's going to go in this book. There were a few things I wanted to point out. In the introduction, I thought a few statements I just wanted to pull out real quick just to give that I think nicely illustrate Wrangham's perspective and Wrangham's arguments. So on page 4, he says, I'm just going to point out a couple of places, a couple of sentences that I really appreciated. On page 4, about halfway down, he says, in short, a great oddity about humanity is our moral range, from unspeakable viciousness to heartbreaking generosity. From a biological perspective, such diversity represents an unsolved problem. If we evolved to be good, why are we also so vile? Or if we evolved to be wicked, how come we can also be so benign? Okay. And then he continues, and then the last sentence of the next paragraph, I think, is, everywhere humans seem to have had the same propensity for both virtue and violence. This is not something peculiar to modern humans, nor is it something peculiar to the Western world. These strands of virtuosity and violence are readily notable in hunter-gatherer studies, in studies dating back to the 1600s, 1700s, and so forth. Again, it's not something that might have been produced by exposure to mass media, for example. Okay. So he goes on to say on page 6, once we acknowledge that we are good and innately bad, the sterile old argument gives way to fascinating new problems. We don't need to obsess on whether we're really good and, or at base good or at base bad. What Wrangham's arguing is that we are at base both. Okay. And as he's introducing the contrast between bonobos and chimpanzees on page 9, he sort of summarizes a bit of this. The top of page 9, he says, as we will see, the notion that either chimpanzees or bonobos, but not both, point to human behavioral origins is not very helpful. And you wouldn't want to say, oh, we're more like chimpanzees. Chimpanzees really capture who we are, or bonobos really capture who we are. He's saying the notion that either chimpanzees or bonobos, but not both, point to human behavioral origins is not very helpful. He says a more intriguing goal is to understand why the two species are similar to humans in their different ways. Okay? Their behavioral contrasts are of a piece with the central question animating this book, which is, why are humans both highly tolerant, like bonobos, that is, they have very low reactive aggression, they can tolerate each other to a remarkable extent, okay? And why are humans also highly violent, like chimpanzees? Okay, it is an interesting puzzle. How is it that we've evolved these two components, only one of which appears to be present in our two closest primate relatives?
Right.
Okay, and another way to state this is on page 9. He says, so our core question becomes two. Why are we so lacking in reactive aggressiveness and yet so highly proficient at proactive aggressiveness? Okay, the answer to the first explains our virtue. The answer to the second accounts for our violence. Just to be clear, then, reactive aggression, he's going to define it shortly. But that's like, lashing out in anger.
Right.
Or rage. Or somebody's irritating you, so you pull out a gun and blow them away. Yes, of course, people do occasionally do such things, but it's atypical. I mean, you have to be a highly tolerant species to deal with, in order to do something like fill up, sports stadiums, with 100,000 people. And I think in a couple of places he makes reference to, just imagine, what a nightmare it would quickly become if you attempted to seat 100,000 chimpanzees in a stadium.
Right.
Well, you even get them seated before violence, broke out. They're highly reactively aggressive. Simply looking at one another in a certain way causes one to, begin to pummel the other.
Right.
They're very intolerant of one another, particularly strangers. That is, chimpanzees that are not part of their group, basically.
Okay.
Okay. He goes on to say, if humans are like a domesticated species, he's going to argue that humans are a domesticated species, that we are domesticated, that more specifically we are self-domesticated, and we've gotten to that point by virtue of selecting against reactive aggression. How do we do that? According to Wrangham, by virtue of what he calls the execution hypothesis. He argues that troublemakers, which are typically males, reactively aggressive individuals over our evolutionary history have routinely been executed or excommunicated, which effectively amounts to execution in any social species.
Right.
Who did these executions? Well, groups of adult males banded together to form coalitions that kept the peace, basically. And they kept the peace by inflicting death on those who refused to keep the peace. It's a very interesting hypothesis that he provides lots of evidence for. So as a consequence, we accidentally, he will argue, nobody did this intentionally, domesticated ourselves, much as did bonobos domesticate themselves. And we'll get there when we get there. Okay, all right. So shall we move into the first chapter, sort of proper?
Yes.
All right.
Oh, and this is where he starts talking about sort of tribal civilizations and how, similarly there, you don't see the level of violence that I guess you might expect. But, even in non-Western societies, he sort of is saying here, very, very little fighting within the community.
True. Yeah, absolutely. Even if we can note that the rates of violence and homicide are much higher in non-Western tribal communities and hunter-gatherer societies, historically, and the data converge, fairly clearly on the conclusion that the Western world, although it may not feel like it, is actually the least violent, not only in terms of anywhere in the world, but in terms of at any point in our recent evolutionary past.
Right.
Let's see. So this is all while recognizing that, he does recognize the fact that violence does occur. Certainly it does occur. And it's, generally to be morally abhorred. I mean, I think generally there seems to have developed a consensus that, violence and murder are not morally good things. But neither, of course, is something like domestic violence. And so he talks a little bit about domestic violence. And while he points out that domestic violence, particularly men's violence against their female partners or against women or against females, male violence against females, while it occurs with much less frequency among humans than among chimpanzees, I think Wrangham is appropriately careful to clarify that he's not suggesting domestic violence isn't a major problem. And it is a major problem. And it is something that we as a society, want to reduce or eliminate. But that's a separate issue from how frequent is domestic violence, particularly male against female, in humans relative to common chimpanzees. And in fact, it's extraordinarily infrequent among humans relative to the frequency with which it occurs in chimpanzees.
Right. And I think he says that, female chimpanzees are beaten daily, if not more, by,
right.
The alpha males in the group.
Yeah, and he also makes reference to some data collected in humans that suggests something like 30% of women in the modern Western world, some experience at least one, episode of domestic violence, and some many more, of course. But then he compares that, and 30%, of course, is not trivial, but that's in contrast to 100% of female chimpanzees having been physically assaulted by a male. Mm-hmm. So the point is, domestic violence in general, is much more frequent and more intense among chimpanzees, and that's and that includes domestic violence. This is a short chapter that just basically is making sure that the reader is absolutely clear on what the paradox is. So I wanted to just highlight the very last paragraph on page 23. He says, high rates of killing or other forms of violence are not inevitable, and there is much variation among societies over time. But overall tendencies are clear. Compared with other primates, we, humans, practice exceptionally low levels of violence in our day-to-day lives. Yet we achieve exceptionally high rates of death from violence in our wars. Okay? That discrepancy is the goodness paradox. Okay? At least in one form.
Right.
Yeah, we have this ability to be incredibly tolerant and giving and cooperative, especially with members of our own group, nation, religion, whatever it is. But at the same time, we have a stunning ability to inflict violence and death on members of outgroups in the form of war, for example. That's the goodness paradox.
And I feel like that is a really good like sort of setup or segue into the next chapter because he sort of explains how it can be possible that is the case, that humans can on the one hand be incredibly tolerant and not reactively aggressive or sort of volatile in that sense, yet they can plan massive executions or genocides or commit atrocities like those committed in like large scale wars, and that explanation being that there are two different types of aggression.
Absolutely. I think Wrangham does a reasonable job of making the case for these two sort of foundational types of aggression. You, the students, won't be surprised to know that aggression has been studied for a very long time in the social sciences. And there are many, many different typologies for how to think about aggression. Some people have argued, no, there's 12 types of aggression. No, there's 10. No, there's 5. No, there's 30. Well, one of the most useful ways of thinking about the different types of aggression, I think, is the way that that Wrangham is presenting this in terms of reactive aggression and proactive aggression. Okay, I mean, people will quibble and have quibbled. As soon as this book was published, people quibbled with, well, that's kind of simplifying things a bit much. But for his purposes, I think it makes sense. These two basic types of aggression, reactive and proactive. So as Wrangham notes on page 25, reactive aggression is a response to a threat. Okay, it's otherwise known as flying off the handle, freaking out, flipping out, blowing up. Okay, it's losing your cool. Okay, yes, of course, it does happen, but it happens with remarkably low frequency, given how many opportunities we have to behave reactively aggressively. Okay, most of the time, even if we don't recognize this, we let things slide. Okay, if somebody bumps us when we're walking, we presume that it wasn't done intentionally, generally speaking, right? We don't freak out and pile drive the person. I mean, generally, people are incredibly tolerant and very forgiving. Okay, that is to say, humans are not especially reactively aggressive. In fact, quite the contrary. We're incredibly tolerant.
And I wonder if that argument might seem surprising or unconvincing to some people just because, it feels right to say that humans seem or are very reactively aggressive. But I agree. I think Wrangham makes a really good argument, not only for this classification, but for the relatively, because I mean, really, I think that's the best way to look at it is relatively, we are less reactively aggressive, especially when you compare us to chimpanzees. And I think, what better comparison? What else is there to compare us to? I mean, compared to our closest primate relatives, including bonobos, who are much less violent and reactively aggressive than chimps or pan troglodytes, common chimpanzees. We're still much, like you said, much more tolerant. And he even
even than bonobos.
Right.
Yeah, so it goes. I mean, so the most tolerant of the three species that Wrangham is going to most frequently refer to: humans, bonobos, and chimpanzees. Okay, humans are by far the most tolerant, the least reactively aggressive, and that can be assessed, and you'll read about it in the book, along a variety of dimensions, using a variety of methodologies. Bonobos are more reactively aggressive than humans. But humans and bonobos both are magnitudes of order less reactively aggressive than our chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are prone to flying off the handle, freaking out. Bonobos, relative to chimpanzees, are not prone to that, to reactive aggression. but they're still more reactively aggressive than our humans,
Right.
which tells you that humans are tremendously tolerant among the great apes.
Is it in this chapter that he talks about, he uses those anecdotes of sort of pet chimpanzees freaking out on people that they're not familiar with?
Let's see. I don't recall if it's in this chapter. Let's see. I think so. No, it might be in a later chapter. He talks about chimpanzees are wild animals. They're not domesticated. So even tame chimpanzees, they've been raised from birth, alongside human children by human parents, still must never be trusted because they're not domesticated. They're not. They're terribly reactively aggressive, and it can often, bubble up unpredictably. Just similarly with wolves, relative to dogs.
Right. Oh yeah, I think that is in a later chapter because that's also where he makes the distinction between, a species that has been bred for domestication over generations versus a wild animal who has been more or less trained, but is still, not trustworthy in that sense.
Yeah, and what we mean when we say not trustworthy means can't be trusted to not behave in a reactively aggressive way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right? I mean, I'm just identifying that that's what we mean, even if we don't think that's what we mean. That's what we mean. Or at least that's what Wrangham would suggest.
Yes, yeah.
So the remainder of this chapter, what Wrangham is doing is, building and sort of codifying sort of making further arguments for why this is a sensible way to think about aggression in these two forms, reactive and proactive. And so he reviews some work on the brains of reactive murderers versus proactive murderers, the different neuroendocrine levels of reactive versus proactive violent individuals. And in each case, there is clearly a distinction, and one can distinguish the two types of murderers or the two types of violent people in terms of whether they're reactive or proactive on the basis of brain structure, brain physiology, neuroendocrine levels. I believe he also makes some reference to hormone levels. I mean, basically, he's building and solidifying his case that this is a reasonable and defensible way to organize and to think about the types of aggression.
Mm-hmm. And he I think further strengthens that argument talking about research in other animals. So basically
Definitely.
saying that, these two different sort of neural pathways for the two different types of aggression is not unique to humans. A similar sort of structure is found in, I think, rats is the example that he uses.
Right. Yeah, so are you suggesting that this distinction isn't peculiar to humans?
Yes.
Right.
I think that's what he's trying to argue, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. Which is worth noting. It's not, it's not a method of distinguishing types of violence or aggression that depends on species. I mean, people can make these distinctions in other species and have made these distinctions in other species. Okay, so let's see. Let me just highlight the last paragraph then I think this is generally true with each of these chapters. I think my recollection is certainly true for this chapter. Wrangham does a nice job of summarizing, okay, this is what you should do as a writer, is you should write your chapter and at the very end, remind your reader what you've told them in this chapter, so they can take with them what you want them to have moving on to the next chapter. So on page 46 then, Wrangham says, all right, he says aggressive behavior is influenced by genes. Okay, proactive and reactive aggression are controlled by different neural pathways and have different scores of heritability, and certain genes promote reactive but not proactive aggression. Okay, all of which suggests these are two real distinctions. These are two distinctly different types of aggression. Okay. He says in the future, we can expect that twin studies, adoption studies, and studies of the genes themselves will increasingly specify separate risk factors for reactive and proactive aggression. For the moment, we can say that the two kinds of aggressive behavior represent sufficiently contrasting emotional and cognitive reactions that they are subject to different biological underpinnings. Fine. Reactive and proactive aggression are therefore expected to be capable of evolving separately from each other. I mean, if they are separate systems, then we ought to be able to see them. We might therefore expect them to evolve separately and to be separately distinguishable, right, in different species and, perhaps at different rates over evolutionary time. Mm-hmm. One Russian experiment found exactly that result with rats. Selection of Norway rats for tameness toward people led to a reduction in reactive aggression, supported by elevated levels of serotonin. There was no change, however, in the rat's propensity for proactive aggression. Now, this is the concluding paragraph. He says, given that humans compared with other species are low on reactive aggression and high on proactive aggression, that is deliberate aggression, planned aggression, the question is why we have this mixture. We start our search for an answer by addressing our low propensity for reactive aggression among animals that are, like humans, unusually docile. Many are domesticated. We need to find out what happens when a species is domesticated. So this next chapter then, he'll make the case that others have made before him, but he's sort of revived. He's reviving an idea that I think fell out of favor, or at least wasn't treated quite as seriously as Wrangham and his colleagues have been treating it over the last few years. And that is that the argument that humans are domesticated species. Most importantly, in the form of our remarkable tolerance for others, our very low levels of reactive aggression.
And so do we want to maybe say, I don't know if we've said it yet, but do we want to mention or say a little bit about what we mean and what I think Wrangham means when he uses the word domestication?
Sure.
I think when he uses it, he does in many ways mean it in the same sense as other domesticated species like dogs, cats, cattle. So.
And for purposes of this book, then, what are the important points about domesticated species?
So, and I think he talks about this in 3 and 4.
Yeah.
But primarily he talks about, well, like we said, or like you just read about the rats, lower reactive aggression specifically. But also he argues that has some other sort of comorbid effects, and he gets into why that is, but specifically some physical effects that go along with domestication.
Such as males becoming more feminized over evolutionary time, with the result that the sexes are less differentiated among domesticated species than among their wild types.
Right. So closer in size to one another, right?
That's right.
Yep.
Right. You also see among domesticated species, relative to their ancestral wild type species, you also see a shortening of the front of the face.
Mm-hmm.
In humans, that's a reduction of the brow. It's a reduction of the mid portion of the face. Again, relative to earlier hominids like Neanderthals, but also relative to chimpanzees and bonobos. You see a reduction in the face. You see, a reduction in sex differences in size. And of course, you see a reduction in reactive aggression.
Right.
So he makes the case that, he takes you through a little bit through, the differences between wolves, which are the ancestors of all dogs. Dogs are domesticated, wolves are not domesticated. Okay? Dogs are remarkably tolerant of other dogs. That's certainly true relative to the remarkably reactive aggressiveness of wolves, okay, with regard to other wolves. So you've got wolves compared to dogs. You've got, he talks a little bit about some other species he talks about in this chapter. Well, he talks about the domesticated foxes.
Yes.
Relative to their wild type ancestors. And again, you see this repeated pattern of a decrease in sex differentiation, a decrease in various features of the head and facial structure. You also see there's another sort of key.
So he talks
trait.
about the domestication effect.
Yeah.
And with the foxes specifically, they were looking to see whether or not they would develop those same characteristics of other domesticated species. Specifically, I remember him talking about the floppy ears and the piebald spotting.
That's right. Yeah, and various really interesting sort of peculiar sort of drag-alongs with domestication. So, like in foxes. You see that some of the foxes, as they move towards domestication, would actually begin barking, like dogs bark. I mean, wolves don't bark and foxes don't bark. Barking seems to be something that is dragged along with domestication. There's some other feature I was going to point out, now I've forgotten it. What are some of the other components of domestication? Oh, I know what it was. It was smaller brain size.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, and that's also something you very often see as a consequence of domestication is a much smaller brain size. Not that the stupider, not at all. Something about the structure of the brain, there may be more folds, more sort of inversions, but the bottom line is you do see this fairly typical decrease in brain size. All of these are part of what Wrangham refers to, and others have referred to as the domestication syndrome. It's a syndrome, a collection of traits, a predictable set of traits that coincide with domestication.
Yeah, and he sets up that question, and then he sort of eventually, I think toward the end of this chapter, he explains why that's the case, and I'm not sure, the small brain thing, I'm not sure if that's comorbid with just a smaller skull size or greater like folds to increase like the surface area of the brain. But I know the floppy ears and the piebald spotting, he talks about being related to one of the genes in embryology not migrating as far as it does in the wild species as a direct result of other selection for other aspects of domestication.
Yeah, right. Yeah, one of the things I'm looking at is, I mean, once you hear this argument, to me it seems in some ways obvious, but you have to appreciate that tons of work, tons of pages have been filled with attempting to independently explain each one of these traits. You've got the piebald coloring. Mm-hmm. Well, the piebald coloring is, because of blah, blah, blah. And then the decrease in sex differences is because of this other issue. And then, the smaller brain size is a consequence of selection on blah, 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 blah. And part of what Wrangham is asking us to appreciate, and again, it's not unique to him. He isn't the creator of this hypothesis, but is that all these go together and they're all explained very parsimoniously as, evolutionarily neutral sort of byproducts of selection. He's going to argue selection for reduced reactive aggression, okay, or increased social tolerance of others. Okay? When you select for, either self-select or are selected by human breeders, for example, for tameness or for lowered reactive aggression, there's a predictable set of traits that emerge over sometimes a very short evolutionary time. And these traits, as Gavin mentioned, are summarized with reference to the domestication syndrome, which humans, other than the floppy ears, humans fit just as clearly as any other domesticated species fits. So the question then becomes, how in the world did this happen? How is it that humans became domesticated? And that takes us into chapter 4, right? Breeding peace. And there are alternative hypotheses, and he takes us through a few of these. I think we have in fact made a few comments that are really best represented in this chapter than in the previous chapter, but that's fine. I mean, all these chapters sort of move, they sort of flow one into the next relatively smoothly. So the question is, what can explain why domesticated animals tend to have these traits? Okay, and he notes that the most popular traditional hypothesis is one that he calls parallel adaptation. According to the parallel adaptation hypothesis, this is on page 65, reduced aggressiveness, white patches, floppy ears, and other features of the domestication syndrome are adaptations that evolved independently in response to a new context, namely living with humans, if you're talking about non-humans. But he points out that others have made the argument that these very traits, rather than having been independently evolved, all are byproducts of selection for reduced aggression, right? And that pulls you towards this notion of the domestication syndrome. The domestication syndrome is a concept that brings together all of these traits that otherwise appear to be so scattered.
Right. And wait, so you're talking about the appeal of the parallel hypothesis?
It was the leading hypothesis
Right.
for the longest time. It probably still is, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Where there's the researcher is attempting to independently explain the evolution, the selection for each one of these different traits, like fur color, facial protrusion, or relative decrease in sex differences. I mean, you can have a go at independently explaining each one of these, or attempting to explain each one of these traits as the outcome of evolution by natural selection. What Wrangham is proposing is that you don't need to do that, because all of these traits are bottled up in one fell swoop, and they are what happen when a species is domesticated. They display what has been referred to as the domestication syndrome, because each of them are byproducts of selection for reduced aggression, selection for reduced reactive aggression in particular.
Yes. And on the next page, or on page 67, he talks about male nipples as another example of byproducts in order to...
Right.
Yeah. In order to explain or, give some more evidence that, you don't need to point at everything and call it an adaptation or something that provided a direct benefit to our ancestors, because you have things like male nipples that are a byproduct of our embryology, pretty much, and of female nipples, which are clearly adaptations. And he makes the argument that the aspects of the domestication syndrome that you were talking about are similar sorts of byproducts of behavioral domestication, I think is a good way to put it.
That's right. Yes, and I think arguably the most famous sort of demonstration of domestication syndrome is that by Belyaev and his colleagues with, I think it was silver foxes in Russia. And he simply selected for, he wanted to select tameness. He wanted to select for tameness or low reactive aggression in wild foxes. I think in part because this would make it easier to farm them for their fur, to the extent that they were less aggressive. But I think he also had some genuinely intellectual interests in whether or not domestication, whether it included these predictable sets of traits. Nobody knew in foxes, but as a matter of fact, this is precisely what he demonstrated in very few generations.
Mm-hmm.
He did select for low reactive aggressiveness, and as a consequence, accidentally produced foxes that had all those traits of the domestication syndrome: the shortened face, the piebald fur, the reduction in sex differences, the smaller brain size, right?
I think so.
Yeah, there may have been a couple. At any rate, so he quickly found. Well, first of all, he was able to successfully domesticate these foxes, and again, within a few generations. And what was interesting is that many of these foxes began behaving much as dogs behave. For example, wagging their tails, licking, a human, and seeking human contact, barking. I mean, all of these were predicted to be byproducts of selection for tameness or selection for reduced reactive aggression. Not because they solve some adaptive problem, but because they are byproducts of domestication. They are features of the domestication syndrome. And so this is a very famous and early demonstration of the domestication hypothesis, that selection for reduced reactive aggression can produce this predictable pattern of traits.
Right. And, they weren't selected for those other traits, those physical characteristics. Those were byproducts. And I don't know to what extent Belyaev tried to, prevent, selecting for any sort of physical features or, keeping himself from being, or him and his research team from being biased in selecting the least reactively aggressive foxes. But he did also, Wrangham mentions somewhere in here that he had a control group of foxes that weren't selected.
Right.
And, they didn't develop the piebald or the floppy ears or any of the physical characteristics.
Right. And that was important because, as he says, as Wrangham mentions, well, at least on page 83 in the summary, which, what amounts to a summary of the chapter. So what that is Belyaev, taught us is that the domestication syndrome is produced by selection against reactive aggression, not merely by living with humans. Okay, so that control group of foxes had as many interactions with humans, right? I mean, they had, they dealt with a human presence. They, this wasn't some, unseen sort of creature. That is, exposure to humans did not automatically produce domestication. It was specifically selection for reduced aggression, that reduced reactive aggression, that produced the domestication syndrome.
Right, exactly. And so it seems like Yeah, so this chapter and the one before it seem sort of in service of, I think, dispelling any sort of like confusion or perceived like mysticism about domestication as this, intangible sort of concept, or that, has these, unanswered questions about, why the physical comorbidities with, uh, domestication or breeding for docility. He's dispelling that. He's answering some of those questions. I think he's giving a pretty comprehensive look at what domestication is, and that it's sort of in and of itself a phenomenon in evolution. And I think I assume, I am reading this for the first time, as many of the students are as well. I assume he's, I think, setting himself up to make a strong case for the argument that domestication has occurred in humans, and that we have self-domesticated, and that our domestication looks very much like the domestication of other species, such as the silver foxes and dogs and whatnot. So
Yes, so he's setting up the reader for his proposal that humans are a domesticated species. Domesticated by whom? Well, not by themselves. Excuse me, not by a god or gods, not by foxes. Humans, in turn, in fact, were self-domesticated. And in fact, he'll tell you about an argument that a researcher called Coppinger has made, which suggests that dogs also are self-domesticated, self-domesticated wolves. That we know, that at least initially, we didn't purposively, and directedly domesticate wolves for our use. There's a much stronger argument that dogs are self-domesticated, which isn't to suggest they tried to domesticate themselves. It's just that they accidentally domesticated themselves. They accidentally selected for reduced reactive aggression. So, what Wrangham is going to argue is that humans are a domesticated species. They're self-domesticated. And how do you get domesticated? Well, you select for reduced reactive aggression. Well, how did humans select for? How did we humans select other humans, for reduced reactive aggression? That's where this will lead him to the hypothesis that he calls the execution hypothesis, which is that we executed the ne'er-do-wells. We, as in our ancestors, our male ancestors, kept things in check by killing people who behaved in reactively aggressive ways.
Right. Right.
It's really,
And so
yeah.
I assume him talking about dogs is sort of to help support the argument that, humans don't need to consciously domesticate a species. It can happen naturally, more or less.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
There was no domesticator of humans.
Right.
There happens to have been a domesticator of foxes. We used to think that there was a domesticator of dogs, but that's because we were relying on recent history. Recent history is over the last 200 years, we as humans have produced, a couple hundred different specific breeds of dogs. But dogs have been around for 15,000 years. It didn't require directed human involvement. The argument, incidentally, is that wolves self-domesticated in their efforts to procure food from human trash sites. So some wolves got a little bit closer, and as a reward, they were a little less reactively aggressive, and took advantage of closer positioning to trash, to human throwaway stuff, most of which is edible. So they accidentally domesticated themselves. Similarly with humans, they accidentally domesticated themselves, according to his argument, by killing those who were most reactively aggressive.
Right.
You're basically just stripping them out of the population.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, so we'll get there, but that sets it up, and that's where he's headed next.
All right, and next week, what is it? Chapters 5 through. Do you remember?
5 through 8. Nope, sorry, 5 through 7. So it's chapter 5 is wild domesticates. Chapter 6 is titled Belyev's Rule in Human Evolution. Okay, and then chapter 7 is the tyrant problem. That's the problem that is solved by the evolution of a psychology that motivates executing bad people.
Right.
By bad people, he's going to hone in on would-be tyrants.
Okay. Yeah. So I feel like that's sort of a big crux of his argument. So I'm excited to get there and discuss that.
Yeah, for sure. All right, very good. Anything further?
No, that is it from me.
Yeah, I think typically, given the amount of material, I think we'll probably spend an hour to an hour and a half each week covering, the 2 or 3 chapters that are assigned for that week. Well, we only have 2 more weeks, so we shall see.
All right.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Gavin.